cover and a short time to do it. Alan Dale is going to join us tonight, but I'm excited because I'm holding in my hand my very first book called JFK Assassination from the Oval Office to DEALEY PLAZA. Notice how I got the DEALEY right, finally, folks. There's that Canadian thing that was bugging everybody when I used to say daily, but I'm still working on about. Interviews with witnesses and specialists, including the last interview with none other than Ted Sorensen, JFK's friend and speechwriter. We're going to talk some more about this book in the next 2 hours, and we're going to be referencing all JFK tonight. Alan Dale's got one of the best resources on the internet. Talk about interviews, folks, with heavy hitters. It's called jfkessentials.com. You will be able to get that link, as always, at www.nightfrightshow.com website. Listen to the heavy hitters Alan has interviewed. Peter Dale Scott. Wow. Jeff Morley. Bill Simpich. Josiah Thompson. Gerald McKnight. Larry Hancock. David Talbot. And Sherry Feaster. Wow, talk about an A-list. Alan, how are you? Thank you for joining us all the way from Washington and rushing back, because I was just speaking to Alan, folks, a few minutes ago, and he was stuck in Washington traffic.
Happy to be here. I'm unstuck, and you make my program sound so exciting. I'm tempted to just, go listen to one of those interviews, but I'll resist the urge.
Well, I would recommend that anybody interested in the JFK assassination and the heavy hitters that are doing the essential research these days, take one good look and one good listen to your interviews, because they are A-list folks and outstanding interviews. This is the deep end of the pool, as Alan likes to call it. Now, listen, how the heck did you get Peter Dale Scott? How'd you coerce him? How much did it cost you? Because I'm checking my book right now, my little checkbook, to see if I can actually maybe offer him $10 more than you did.
Mm-hmm. Well, I could tell you some elaborate story that would be, interesting and stimulating, but that would be false, because the truth is that I was given his email address by a mutual friend, and I contacted him and I said, "Hi, you don't know me, but..." And the short version of the story is that he agreed to do our interview, and I was excited. I was exhilarated. This is a man of ultimate stature, not merely among respected and influential and relevant JFK research scholars, but for people really all over the world, people who love words, people who are affected by poetry. People who are knowledgeable about international diplomacy, people who love the English language. Professor Scott is Professor Emeritus of English at the University of California, Berkeley, which was ground zero during the peak of the countercultural revolution in the 60s. He's a former diplomat. He lived in Poland behind the Iron Curtain during an era of police state mechanism.
Cold War, and also Professor Scott is a Canadian. He was a Canadian.
You just took the words right out of my mouth. I thought it might be appealing to you that he is indeed. His father was an educator and a poet in Canada, and he was born, raised, educated in part there. But really, he is somebody that I consider one of these extraordinary, and I'll use the word, among people that I admire, Professor Scott is actually, I'll resist saying revered, but the truth is he is revered. He's revered the way people around Jacques Cousteau revered Jacques Cousteau. I think he's a citizen of the world. And with regard to the focus of JFK research, Professor Scott is someone who has helped illuminate the path of a succession of generations of our most intrepid and most serious and most scholarly researchers, people who take very seriously not just the subject of gaining information, but the process by which we may learn that the information we're gaining is reliable. And that's an essential element in terms of, I think, what Professor Scott has contributed. Peter Dale Scott wrote a book a couple of decades ago now called Deep Politics and the Death of JFK. And it was succeeded by Deep Politics 2 and Deep Politics 3. These are the primary resources. They're not the only ones, but they're the primary resources of the material we associate with Professor Scott. And what he's done is he's really kind of helped define particular areas of interest, particular areas of concern.
What are those concerns, Alan?
Well, the concern... That's an excellent question. That's a very good question. The concern really is that there is evidence, superficial evidence, by reading the news, by watching television, by reading what's being printed in history books. There's superficial evidence that there is something at work in our society, and perhaps something at work globally, that is a mechanism of power, the means by which power is exercised in the modern world, which seems to be either extra or anti or non-constitutional. And Professor Scott coined the phrase parapolitics, the term parapolitics back in the 70s, to describe what he thought was going on, at least to be able to offer some sort of description of some of the mechanisms by which power was being exercised, which included what I think can properly be referred to as strange bedfellows. And strange bedfellows really just means elements within society that seem disparate, that you would think would be in opposition to one another, but which in truth seem to have a relationship beneath the surface, which defies common sense, or defies basic sort of intuition, defies the basic course of our indoctrination.
Could you give us an example of what you...
Well, the best example really is, I think, probably the example that forced Professor Scott to expand upon his original designation of parapolitics, and that is his invocation, his coinage of the term deep politics. And deep politics for him really evolved, I believe, sometime during the course of his realization that there seemed to be underlying continuities and underlying contexts and underlying connections between Watergate and the assassination of President Kennedy. And on the surface, you'd say, well, surely there's no connection possible here, that this seems like an improbable thing, unless you have revealed to you somewhere along the line that the United States government had an authorized relationship with elements of organized crime back conceived and initiated during the last year of President Eisenhower's administration, something that was inherited by the 35th President of the United States, a secret collaboration initiated by the CIA with the Mafia for the mutual and I guess what was thought at the time to be the mutual advantage of conspiring together to assassinate foreign head of state Fidel Castro. And so the news that the CIA would officially, in an ultimate secret compartment, have a relationship, develop a relationship, initiate a relationship. Their relationship with organized crime, I think, did not begin with the program intended to result in Fidel Castro's government being replaced by a pro-Western regime, but it certainly may be the first time where, at least it's documented, so far as I'm aware, where the CIA was engaging the Mafia for the explicit purpose of murdering a head of state. I'm not sure that that has been documented as ever having happened up until that point. This is the peak of the period during which the Dulles brothers, John Foster Dulles, secretary of his brother Alan Dulles, were essentially kind of the means by which President Eisenhower sort of outsourced his foreign policy. And so all of that is sort of the context of what Professor Scott was looking at in terms of the moment that President Kennedy was sworn into office. The context of the moment, Cold War-wise, includes this deep political collaboration between elements of the government of the United States and a network of organized criminals. And so that's really, I think, the beginning of how deep politics started becoming a term that educated people around the world who might be curious or confused by what's going on and how it's happening. A term that people can use and understand. It provides a common frame of reference.
Get the coffee going, get the tea going, get a beverage of your choice, folks. Don't go anywhere, because this show is going to be one explosive show. We're talking with Alan Dale tonight. Now, I first met Alan last year at the conference in November 22nd. JFK Lancer puts on. Deborah Conway put on a magnificent job, and Alan, and of all the people she could have chosen to MC the whole affair, she chose Alan Dale because he was the most knowledgeable. That is kudos, folks. I'm telling you, this guy knows his stuff inside out. Listen to some of the folks he has interviewed for his show called JFKEssentials.com. And, of course, you'll be able to get that link at www.nightfright.show. Here's the heavy hitters. We were just talking about Peter Dale Scott, Jeff Morley, Bill Simpich, Josiah Thompson, 6 Seconds in Dallas. Everybody knows that groundbreaking work. Gerald McKnight, who wrote an incredible book on how the Warren Commission completely failed the American people. Larry Hancock's been on this show many, many times. You know that this guy is an astute researcher. David Talbot wrote a great book called Brothers, and Sherry Feaster, who is also featured in my book called JFK Assassination, from the Oval Office to DEALEY Plaza. Sherry is the sister of Deborah Conway, and she is a senior crime scene investigator. And we're going to go right there now with Alan, but I just want to set it up. She is a senior crime scene investigator who found a frontal shot using 21st century forensics that were not available in 1963. What did you walk away with when you interviewed Sherry?
That's an excellent question. Well, I'll tell you, in all honesty, I had my interest in President Kennedy's assassination and understanding the context, the meaning of his assassination, really hardly had ever touched upon the actual forensics of the crime scene. And the reason that I say that is because I was confronted by the same thing that I think many of us are, and that is the fact that in an area where a specific area of research where experts disagree, those of us who are not experts are disadvantaged. And so all I knew for certain was that the evidence of the scene, the specific sequence of the shooting, understanding exactly what happened, was something that educated people of all walks of life and people who specialize in criminal investigation, people who specialize, medical professionals, people who are crime scene reconstructionists, people who are historical researchers. You would hardly find two people who agreed, with the possible exception of those who suggest and defend the absurd proposal that there's really nothing new that's relevant to this story since the publication of the Warren Commission report in September of 1964. So without being too concerned about the people who feel that there's really nothing to be learned, nothing of any relevance, since 1964, I was aware that even people that I admired, whose work on different areas of these subjects, which had affected my growth and my awareness, you could hardly find two people, even educated people, who would agree. And the extent to which I had concluded anything really was that I was uncomfortable with the dogma that there was a shooter from behind the Grassy Knoll picket fence on the right side of Elm Street. And the reason that I was uncomfortable with that is because I had absorbed entirely too much of the argument that there were grainy photographs that had been blown up to grainier excerpts which depicted blobs and splotches that I should be able to interpret, in a Rorschach-ian sense as somebody with a badge, somebody without a badge, somebody dressed like a dog, somebody not wearing a hat, all kinds of strange claims about what was revealed by close scrutiny of these materials. In the middle of the day, when the sun was shining and there were Secret Service professionals within, some number of feet of that particular area who were seeing it in real life and who were not dependent upon, some sort of photographic interpretation. I thought that it seems improbable to me that someone could have been firing a shot without being seen, and the truth is I'm unaware of anybody that I consider to be reliable. And I suppose that's the key for each of us. We each are on our own path, separate journey from Dallas to the present, and along the way we pick everything up and we examine it, and some people, will keep everything and other people will discard most of whatever they find. But you have to invest the necessary time, you have to invest the necessary effort, and one of the things that I had examined, I felt sufficiently well to have concluded that there was absolutely no evidence whatsoever of which I'm aware that any witness present on the scene saw someone firing a rifle or anything else at President Kennedy from that location. I thought that that was really the primary issue for me, at least with regard to the forensic assessment of the shooting sequence itself. I also became very interested in the work of a great scholar named Dr. David Mantik. And Dr. David Mantik had examined the X-ray materials. I walked away from that being confused about whether we should feel confident that the X-ray materials that are available at the National Archives are legit, but I believe I understood that David Mantik was insistent that there could not have been a shooter from the particular spot that is usually alluded to as an ultimate and an agreed upon part of this story in the form of someone behind the picket fence, in the
Grassy Knoll.
Yeah, on the Grassy Knoll. But his conclusion was that the shooter had to be further up, or I should say further down Elm Street. You and I were in Dealey Plaza last year. I hadn't been there. I lived in Dallas for a short time as a child. I had not been to Dealey Plaza, and something I would say to anyone who has never been there, I was shocked at the declination, the degree, the severe angle that goes from high to low, from the point where Houston turns onto Elm, where the motorcade turned from Houston onto Elm, and then reaches the point at the bottom of this decline where the triple underpass or triple overpass, depending upon your perspective, I suppose, the bridge. I was really surprised, really, how high the street is at Houston and how low it is at the bottom of that bridge. And I would say that truly, if you've only seen the Zapruder film, and we've all seen the Zapruder film, innumerable times, then our recollection of the sequence of the shooting is based almost exclusively upon, the impact of seeing that ghastly sequence. And it's very horizontal. It seems very horizontal. And so I was not aware until I was there the extent to which the street goes downhill. And something occurred to me at some point, maybe a couple of years ago, and what occurred to me was, what if there was a shooter elsewhere in the front, because I believe President Kennedy was clearly shot from the front, but that something was going on maybe behind the fence in terms of an operational element of a coordinated attack upon the president, and that something might have been, it might have come in the form of a distraction, like a firecracker. There was a lady who approached one of the first police officers on the scene, and she said, if I understand this correctly, and I believe I do, her exact words to the cop were, they're shooting the president from the bushes. And I don't think she was referring to George Herbert Walker Bush. I think she was referring to something that drew her attention in a bush in that area. And so we've learned that using firecrackers as a distraction to draw people's attention in one area so that a kill shot might come from a different area is something that it has a place in terms of military applications. It's not a new concept. It's probably a very old concept, but it has been employed in combat at least since World War II and probably prior to that. So I was confused, basically, because I had never been to Dealey Plaza. I hadn't looked around. I couldn't imagine that anybody was standing on top of the railroad bridge firing at President Kennedy. I didn't know what other options might exist. And then along comes professional crime scene investigator with a particular area of expertise in crime scene reconstruction. Somebody who has participated in lots of legal court cases where she was testifying, bringing her expertise to help influence a jury, focusing on the particular areas of her expertise, which include crime scene reconstruction and something called blood spatter, S-P-A-T-T-E-R, not S-P-L, blood spatter analysis. And her story you can learn by simply clicking on your interview with her, which I saw before I had ever met her and which was informative for me, so thank you for that. And then ultimately my review of her book, I wrote a review and I interviewed her on my program, which is the JFK Lancer Conversations program, available at jfklancer.com. in which she described a scenario for me, and I don't want to spend an enormous amount of time on this, but I think it's important because this is what she said. Basically, two things that I took away. And you asked me what I came away with. I came away with two things more than anything else. The first is that President Kennedy was turned 25.5 degrees, approximately 26 degrees to the left of profile at frame 312 in the Zapruder film. And as improbable as it sounds, the physics, the geometry, the mathematics of the relationship between Abraham Zapruder's camera at that point in this god-awful sequence, which is preserved in its entirety for all time, that is the closest point. Frame 312, a split, maybe 1/18 of a second before the ultimate culmination of the sequence in the form of the brutal headshot and then President Kennedy's entire upper body being moved so violently back and to the left. Whereas Dr. Josiah Thompson says every cell, every molecule of your body, once you see this, it tells you he was shot from the front. And, you know, fantastical depictions of theoretical physics, you know, be damned. Everything in your body sees this, you see this, and you know that he was shot from the front. But the thing that Sherry Feaster asked is, where is front? If his head is turned 25.5 degrees to the left of the center of the automobile,
he's facing towards the southern part of the ground.
That is it exactly. He's facing the opposite. That's it exactly. He's facing the opposite side of the street. It renders the traditional, dogmatically accepted idea of a shooter behind the grassy knoll. It renders that to a position of approximately 90 degrees. And if somebody's firing a rifle, the bullet is traveling 2,000 feet per second or more. The idea that it should enter the side of President Kennedy's head but not traverse the midline of the skull, I think is not, it's not plausible. So what we have in its place is President Kennedy's head is moved 25.5 degrees to the left of profile, to the left of center. A bullet strikes him in the right side of the head. It does enormous damage to the right hemisphere of the head. And it exits the right hemisphere of the head. It does not traverse, it doesn't cross, it doesn't enter into the other side of his head. And because of that, which I think Sherry would say to you is a fact, what she was able to do is she was able to construct what's called a trajectory cone. The trajectory cone was 35 degrees, both vertical and horizontal. It covers an area exactly opposite side of the 3 lanes, the 3 streets that converge there at DEALEY Plaza. And it puts a shooter with an unobstructed shot, making at least one shot of extraordinary precision that strikes President Kennedy in the right temple, exits the right side or right rear of his head, but does not traverse the midline of the skull. And that if she would say that if you've ever played pool, you've struck a cue ball on the, say, left side of another ball, used a cue ball to strike another ball the left side of that ball will go to the right. It'll go back and you know, to the right from your perspective. So I think that what she's introduced there, based upon her understanding of contemporary forensics, and especially the benefit of the last 20 years, but maybe the last 10, 12 years in particular, where medical professionals and criminologists and physicists are doing research all over the world. Some of her sources come from Germany. And what we've learned is the result of having available to us high-speed photography, the likes of which is truly astonishing, head wound ballistic research, all kinds of things with sort of complicated phrases, skull fracturing sequence studies, all kinds of things which certainly did not exist during the first several decades of this investigation. I think you can properly say that CSI has finally caught up with Dallas. And that's what I think Sherry Feaster's work is. And in addition to that, I would say, honestly, I also think that Professor or Dr. Josiah Thompson has made an enormous contribution to our understanding, because he is the person who popularized in his classic book, 1967's 6 Seconds in Dallas. He's the person that really influenced everybody who came to this story there from that point forward by describing President Kennedy's forward motion prior to violent movement back, and he has changed his perception of that, and he has a lot to say about where we are at this point, and where in his understanding of it in this point, and the story of his evolution from 1967's 6 Seconds in Dallas to his current book, which I believe as yet is unpublished, but we're very, very hopeful that it will be published. It's called Last Second in Dallas, and people who are interested in Dr. Josiah Thompson, who's I think one of our Mount Rushmore figures in all of this, I think that they might be very interested in the two interviews, rather, that I've conducted with him, which are available at JFK Lancer Conversations page.
.com, jfklancer.com. You'll find a link there, folks, for all of Alan Dale's great interviews with some heavy hitters. And just to close out on Sherry Feaster, she is also featured in my book, JFK Assassination, from the Oval Office to DEALEY Plaza, interviews with witnesses and specialists, including the last interview with Ted Sorensen, JFK's friend and speechwriter. You'll be able to get that at www.nightfrightshow.com as well. What she's essentially saying, folks, and guaranteeing there was a headshot from the front, and that proves conspiracy, but not the kill shot did not come from the Grassy Knoll. So read the book, listen to the interviews with Alan, and that'll tell you more about that as well. Okay, you had mentioned Josiah Thompson. He's a heavy hitter, 6 seconds in Dallas.
Oh, I love that guy.
No kidding. I should give you this, by the way, too, folks, www.nightfrightshow.com. Just click on tonight's guest link, and that'll take you right to his interviews. 2 places to get them. One is jfkessentials.com. The other one is jfklancer.com. Either way, you're going to get the best of the best of the best.
Well, that's nice of you to say. Thank you.
And
let me just, if I may, just acknowledge a woman in Australia who's a friend of mine named Mary Considine. And Mary has volunteered and works, and I know you know the value of someone who's willing to do something for you at no charge, so I'm speaking your language. She has worked very hard and is continuing to do so to provide written transcripts of all of my programs. She's done about half a dozen so far. That includes our friend Jefferson Morley from the Washington Post, former Washington Post reporter, host of JFKFacts.org, the author of Our Men in Mexico, Winston Scott, and the Hidden History of the CIA, which I think is an absolutely essential work that everyone should avail themselves. She's done written transcript of one of my 2 conversations with Bill Simpich, whose book State Secret is available free at the Mary Farrell Foundation, and it is, I think, really and truly, it is where we are at the moment in terms of understanding the enigmatic and mysterious and significant complexities of an episode in Mexico City centered around Lee Oswald 7 weeks and 6 weeks prior to the assassination. 7 weeks because in late September, early October, something strange was going on in Mexico City involving a figure who's claimed his name was Lee Oswald. And for all I know, it may have been Lee Oswald. And ultimately, we have very, very good reason to be confident that that figure was impersonated in telephone conversations, which were then picked up through routine surveillance of the Cuban consul at the Soviet Embassy in Mexico City and were transcribed by a husband and wife team called Boris and Anna Tarasov, and these people transcribed these conversations. Basically, I'm giving you a short version, but essentially on behalf of the CIA. And once CIA looked at this material during the following week, CIA, the story, Bill Simpich tells the story of not only what happened 7 weeks that put all of this into motion, but I think most revealingly, most significantly, what happened the following week. How did the CIA respond to the appearance of this Lee Oswald and his impersonation? And how did the CIA respond to it in the days, weeks, months, and years following that event? Because obviously it's one sort of set of circumstances which can only be interpreted however it's interpretable prior to the assassination. But once the name Lee Oswald is connected to being the accused assassin of a popular sitting president, it becomes something else, and that's what State Secret is about, and it is an extraordinary contribution to where we are. He's building upon the work of Peter Dale Scott. He's building upon the work of Dr. John Newman, whose books JFK and Vietnam, 1993, and especially his 2008 edition of Oswald and the CIA. These are the stepping stones. These are the building platforms. These are the stations upon which solid understanding and solid assessment and a reliable opportunity to begin to sort of assess and interpret these extraordinary moments in the story may be made. We're not talking about thin ice with these guys. We're talking about standing on solid ground, and I believe we owe them a great thanks. I think we owe them some gratitude. And that's what I'm really trying to do with the show.
I should also mention Bill Simpich will be here next week, folks, and we'll be delving into that whole mystery of the purported Oswald trip to Mexico City and what that means in terms of espionage, what that means in terms of the big picture of the assassination. And that's something I wanted to bring up with you. This is something we've talked about many times. I find too many people get stuck in Dealey Plaza instead of zooming out and looking at everything that's going on around that time period, before the time period, and directly after the time period, and the consequences thereof. Yeah. Do you feel the same way?
Oh, boy, do I ever. I mean, I think you just said it very well, because if you want to believe that the assassination of President Kennedy was an aberration, and that the great story, that the big picture comes from the lesson of history is that our system is so strong and has such integrity that there was no discernible change in terms of the direction of the government, that it was a seamless transition, and that this is a credit to our noble institutions and the fundamental constitutional system that was set up to respond to a crisis such as this. If you want to believe that, then I can shrug and say, well, it's been nice talking to you. Or if you want to really examine the context of the post-World War II era, and in particular, examine the work of that I think a great scholar like Larry Hancock has done in his book Shadow Warfare, where we're looking not exclusively at events since the conclusion of World War II, but I would say worthy of our scrutiny and worthy of our study is the point at which the National Security Act of 1947 was signed into law, which gave sort of an autonomy to the CIA, which may not have existed prior to that in its other forms, Office of Strategic Services or whatever branches of, military intelligence may have been a resource for the president, and has theoretically existed to serve the interest of the executive branch prior to that. So my concern, one of the concerns that you and I have discussed privately, is just the idea that you meet people who decide, for whatever reason, people of all ages, who have become or are becoming interested in President Kennedy's assassination. And I think the huge mistake is focusing on one day, because I think this is a story where what's revealing and what ultimately emerges has to do with recognizing what was different, if anything, in terms of what John Kennedy as a human being brought to that office, in contrast to what was there, who was there, what were the dogmas, and what was the sort of prevailing gestalt, the mentality, the system of differentiating between what's real and what isn't, what's important, what isn't, prior to his taking office, and especially after surviving whatever the Bay of Pigs represents in terms of a changing or a defining moment in President Kennedy's presidency, because it happened within the first 3 months of his being there. It had all been planned prior to that, and without insisting that the main issues of President Kennedy's 2 years, 10 months, and 2 days in office pertaining to foreign policy have to do with, as Jim DiEugenio would say, Monday, Cuba, Tuesday, Russia, Wednesday, CIA, Thursday, Cuba, Friday, Russia, Saturday, CIA. It turns out there was quite a lot else going on around the world, in Africa, in all kinds of places that were the subject of his interest and his consideration. But the Cuba thing is something that was really prominently dropped in his lap immediately, because it had been inherited. It was an operation in progress when he was sworn in on January 20th of 1961. So if we want to sort of deal with assessing the fact of the assassination, I think one of the important and necessary and reasonable things to do is to sort of try to get a sense of what kind of person was President Kennedy, what kind of leader was he, what were his ideas or philosophies or his ideals, or, are there patterns, are there arguments that can be made, that he was either a typical Cold Warrior or possibly something uncommon in that era. Young combat veteran of World War II who saw really the consequences of the detachment that military executives at the top of the food chain, they made decisions which were consequential to people at the bottom. And I think that my take on all of it is that if you want to study President Kennedy's assassination, it would be to your advantage to know who his friends were and who his enemies were. And that's something that you get out of reading history books. It's not something you get necessarily out of only reading about the assassination, which I think will give you a distorted and an inaccurate and an incomplete perception of big picture issues.
Do you feel that some of the people Ted Sorensen had mentioned to me in my interview with him may have been part of that assassination? And he mentions the military intelligence as well as the mafia as well as the CIA. Do you think some of those players were involved?
I think that it's reasonable that there's informed conjecture, and I would say that his perception is not anything that I would dismiss. I would say that we can, I think with reason, we can know that Ted Sorensen and a number of the other people who really were close to President Kennedy, who knew him best and who loved him the most, are not people to whom we should turn if we're looking for research on the assassination. That even someone for whom I have the absolute highest esteem, Clint Hill, I don't expect Clint Hill to be knowledgeable about the current state of assassination research. I don't know if he's read some of the things that I think have been introduced, especially during the period since the JFK Records Act, the release of an enormous number of materials which the people creating those materials back 50 years ago almost certainly would have hardly believed that we would have access to some of this stuff. So I'm aware that the people who loved President Kennedy and were profoundly impacted by his death, and then 5 years later, the people, many of the same people who were very loyal to Robert Kennedy were engaged, as Ted Sorensen was, reluctantly in that 85-day campaign in 1968 to help Robert Kennedy win the Democratic nomination to become his party's nominee to oppose a sitting president, Lyndon Johnson, in 1968. I don't think that those people, I should think that we would have reason to conclude that the subject of President Kennedy's assassination was too painful for them to closely examine. But what's impactful to me about your contribution to this area in the form of these conversations, which you had the great foresight and good sense to record, is that we're listening to Ted Sorensen within the context. It's a social construct. He's speaking to someone that he has not known for very long, but he can tell he's a very educated, very perceptive, very sensitive human being. So he can tell you're a nice guy. He can tell you're a nice guy, and he's speaking to you, I thought, rather candidly, because it was so obvious that you were friendly, that you were somebody who was on his side, that you were somebody who understood something about why his story is compelling and why we are absolutely indebted to Ted Sorensen for his role in coming to a peaceful resolution, helping President Kennedy and Robert Kennedy come to a peaceful resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of '62. He's being pretty candid with you when, at that point in his life, we're hearing some indication that he has reflected upon these assassinations. And regardless of whatever he may have ultimately concluded in his own mind, if he did, I think the fact that he's having that particular conversation with you at all, right towards the very end of his time on Earth, I think is revealing. And he is making the same case that even people like Teddy White made decades earlier, that if you want to know something about the Kennedy brothers, it's important to read their words, listen to their speeches, and look at the historical record of whatever they had accomplished. But it's equally informative to study who were their enemies, who hated them. And so if Ted Sorensen is saying, who can say, it's not like there wasn't a long list of people who would have wanted him dead. And essentially that's what Ted Sorensen is saying among organized crime elements within the Pentagon and certainly elements within the CIA. I think that's what he's saying, and he may have not been able ever to go any deeper than that because that might have been sufficient for him. But I think it is interesting, to say the least, that Ted Sorensen admitted with you that he was willing to entertain the possibility that the Warren Commission didn't exactly tell the entire story in September of 1964.
And I should mention, folks, that that came about by complete accident. I went down to meet with Ted at his Manhattan apartment, spent the afternoon with him, and brought my camera, thank God, because it turned out to be his last interview. And I go into far greater detail in my new book called JFK Assassination. From the Oval Office to DEALEY PLAZA, you can order that at www.nightfrightshow.com. We're speaking tonight with Alan Dale. Alan Dale has one of the best resources on the internet called JFKessentials.com. His interviews with some of the heaviest hitters of the research community on JFK can be found also at jfklancer.com. Let's go into Gerald McKnight a little bit, because he wrote an explosive book on how the Warren Commission failed. What did you walk away from Gerald McKnight's interview?
Well, just that, to tell you the truth, I know we're not going to spend a lot of time on media criticism, although it is part of the story. I mean, what Professor Scott refers to as the governing media, and what an appropriate, I think, term it is that he came up with to describe the way stories which are unpopular, or subjects which are unpopular, are depicted in mainstream media. The thing that I came away with, aside from great admiration and gratitude, which is always implicit, in terms of my feelings towards the people that I have the privilege of, with whom I have the privilege of discussing these related subjects, very grateful to him for his contributions, and also truly just appalled that someone of his stature and the quality of his scholarship, the quality of his research. He's professor emeritus at Hood College in Frederick, Maryland, and professor emeritus of history. He's somebody for whom history is not dry. It's not days and dates and, figures that we have no sense of three-dimensionally. He's offering us insight and a glimpse into the interior of the Warren Commission at the highest level, in terms of the old men who sat around a table and watched Allen Dulles smoke his pipe and pontificate, and the people in the field, many of whom were FBI agents. Because the Warren Commission really didn't do any investigating itself. The report was compiled largely upon the work of the FBI, which was largely dependent upon the CIA for whatever information they were getting about American intelligence interest or awareness or focus upon Lee Oswald, because he'd spent time in the Soviet Union, married a Russian woman, had a child, came to this country, had another child, and seemed to have been engaged in some effort to get back into the Soviet Union via Cuba in October of 1963, and that's what that episode in Mexico City, that's part of what that entails. But Professor McKnight is somebody that he has done the work for us in terms of giving us properly a deeper perspective on how the Warren Commission functioned and why its conclusions, I think, lack veracity. And he's handing it to us simply by buying his book, Breach of Faith, which, by the way, was updated last year and has additional materials which I think are actually of value. It wasn't like, how sometimes, there's an historical anniversary or something, so somebody just slaps a new cover on something and stakes it out because they know they'll sell some copies, and that's fine because some people missed it the first time around. But in this case, Breach of Faith by Gerald D. McKnight actually has some additional material in the 2013 edition, which I think is makes it even more recommendable. The same is true with regard to some work that Jim DiEugenio did last year, and also John Newman's 2008 edition of Oswald and the CIA and things like that. But Professor McKnight has done quite a lot that I think is worthy of our attention. I think it's important to be aware of some of these people who are literally saying to us, hey, in case you didn't know. And then they're handing it to us on a silver platter, and it's never represented as an ultimate conclusion, or at least hardly ever. Mostly it's, look, we're trying to get closer to the finish line, however you might define the finish line. And it helps us to gain new knowledge in our process of seeking deeper understanding and having the benefit of researchers of the caliber of the stature of someone like Gerald McKnight is to our mutual advantage.
What brought you into the JFK assassination?
I'm a product of my time.
Me too.
And, I think that there is something about youth, not a time of life, but a state of mind, a temper of the will, a quality of the imagination, a predominance of courage over timidity, of the appetite for adventure over the love of ease. I think there's something about being young and being stimulated by whatever it is that you find stimulating that really affects the rest of your life. And so I had extraordinary and improbable proximity to both JFK and Robert Kennedy when I was very young. My parents were people that I would characterize now as Kennedy loyalists. They fell in love with JFK during the campaign of 1960, and they were excited by him. They were of his generation. My dad was also a World War II veteran, was a bubble gunner on a B-29. Because he was a musician, he had the word maestro painted underneath his bubble on that B-29, called Underexposed. And people of World War II generation, I think, who could relate more to this very glamorous, very, very handsome, and very articulate and inspiring younger man, were moved by that to a far greater extent than someone of the generation of older generation who was more paternalistic, more of a father figure, I suppose, someone like General Eisenhower, or Harry Truman. These were old men. JFK was young and appeared to be, vibrant and all of that. And so they were taken in by that. I wouldn't necessarily say seduced, but in the truest sense of the word, I think they certainly were. They were seduced not only by his personal charm, but by, his inspiring message, which equated, it was from a time when the word liberal referred to progressive and intellectual and cultured, in contrast to which we had a civil war taking place within the United States over civil rights, over the war in Vietnam, eventually all kinds of things that represented elements of society in opposition to each other, in conflict with each other, to such an extent that some people might say that the fabric of the society was tearing itself apart. That's the environment that produced successive terms of someone like Richard Nixon. But there were people who were kind of idealistic, maybe naive, and who wanted us to have a future where children could grow up without the fear of war. And so they were inspired by JFK, they loved Jackie, they thought the kids were cute, and they were profoundly impacted by his assassination. I was 3 years old when President Kennedy was assassinated. It was profoundly impactful in ways that you simply, I think you'd be challenged to convince a young person, product of decades of cynicism and redirection away from issues of civic duty or what it means to be a good citizen in the sense of, things that Adlai Stevenson wrote about or spoke about.
We're coming up to break.
Okay.
Okay. There's the music right there. Folks, Alan Dale's our guest tonight. Stick around. We've got more coming. Some incredible information about some of the folks you it's David Melvin, Larry Hancock, Jeff Morley. On the Night Fright Show on Thank you, Camilo. Welcome back, folks. Welcome to Night Fright. I am your host, Brent Holland. www.nightfrightshow.com. www.nightfrightshow.com. There you will find a wealth, an absolute wealth of JFK interviews and material. Just click on the link that says JFK, and that'll take you to all of our JFK material. And nobody does JFK better than Night Fright. Our guest tonight is Alan Dale. He has one of the best resources on the internet for JFK material. Speaking of, it's called jfkessentials.com. And an easy way to get to his interviews with some heavy hitters, who I will name in a second, is just go to the jfklancer.com website. Here's some of the people we've been speaking about tonight that he has interviewed. Peter Dale Scott, Jeff Morley, Bill Simpage, Josiah Thompson, Gerald McKnight, Larry Hancock, David Talbot, and Sherry Feaster. Now, these are all heavy hitters in terms of research, folks. Was there a common ground, Alan, running through all of the people that you interviewed? Was there a common thread that led you to interview these folks instead of perhaps someone else?
Yeah, the common thread is myself. The common thread really is that the particular people that I've been allowed to talk with are people whose work I'm really looking, in all honesty, I'll have to concede this, I'm really looking to promote the work and draw attention, do what little I can do to make a contribution in terms of helping to introduce their work to our society, and doing what I can, to simply encourage people, whoever we speak with or whoever listens to the material that we're producing. I'm basically saying I'm not necessarily agreeing with every word that every person, and my guess no two people, are in absolute, ultimate, complete accordance in every possible nook and cranny, but there is sort of a consensus among the people with whom I speak, and that consensus, I suppose, it takes many different forms, but essentially the common thread is that something something terrible happened on November 22nd that is more than, an aberration in the form of a lone nut who takes it upon himself to alter history. And I think that the other thing that if there is sort of a methodology that I believe these people share in common, it is that the people that I admire the most and whose work I think is most reliable, most informative, and most thought-provoking, these people are very, very, very cautious about making claims that are not that either cannot be known or cannot be substantiated. The people whose work I admire the most are mindful of the distinction between perception and reality. And so they're cautious. I mean, I'll give you an example, if I may.
Sure.
The work that I alluded to earlier today, I mean, you and I would concede that I really want to go back just for a moment to your question about how I got into it. I was, I think, 15 years old when Geraldo Rivera and Robert Groden and Dick Gregory broadcast the Zapruder film on consecutive weeks in March of 1975. And seeing the film for the first time was very impactful to me, because I grew up in a household where we loved the guy. We love President Kennedy. We loved him. Still do. And seeing him die like that was impactful on several different levels. And in one way, it was certainly impactful because, as we already alluded to, what Dr. Thompson says, everything in your body, every fiber of your being says he was shot from the front. And so I had read one book on the assassination prior to that experience, and it was one of the very earliest books. It was called Who Killed Kennedy by a man named Thomas G. Buchanan. And so I felt that there was something there. This happened to be the era of Watergate. It happened to be post period of people's blind acceptance that what their government was saying would be true. That if the government was telling you something, you believed it because it was in part your duty as a good citizen to believe your own government, right? How unpatriotic it would be. How unpatriotic are you if you don't believe your own government? Don't you know the difference between the good guys and the bad guys? America, love it or leave it. That was the era, right? Well, the times, as Bob Dylan would want you to know, the times are a-changin', and the era of Watergate, the era of Nixon, the era of Vietnam, the era of revelations that were staggering news to our elected officials about what Lyndon Johnson, said, kind of under his breath, I believe, about the CIA running a GD Murder Incorporated in the Caribbean, I think that there were profound revelations during this period, the Church Committee and whatever happened thereafter, House Select Committee on Assassinations, all that stuff. So we were living in an era during that time where it was in the air that people were inspired by what they thought they understood about Woodward and Bernstein, and people could act, could learn and act in ways that basically put the country first in opposition to the government. Think about that, putting the country first by opposing the sitting government. That was, an interesting period of some revolution in a way. And when Oliver Stone decided to sort of consolidate best part of 30 years worth of research and conjecture and put it together so artfully and so impressively that in that year both Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert voted JFK to be the best picture of the year. They both thought, they agreed for once, they thought it should have won the Oscar in the year that The Silence of the Lamb won, just based upon the quality of the filmmaking. But the truth is, certainly in the case of Roger Ebert, there were lots of educated people who felt that we had been lied to by our government about something so important, that what could be more important than the circumstances by which a popular president is gunned down in the middle of the street, in the middle of the day, in the presence of his wife. So I think that if there's a theme among the people whose work I admire the most, it is that we are a product of this era where we had revelations in the investigation of our own government and the lies and the deceit and the misrepresentations, the pretexts for war, the great crisis in America between the young and the old, between the rich and the poor, certainly manifested as conflict between black and white, and that there was something during that era, and I'm referring primarily to, what grew out of the Vietnam, a period of profound civil unrest and conflict. I think that what grew out of that was a sense that there are stories beneath the surface that need to be told. And if there is a consensus among many of the people that I admire the most, it is that the CIA has a lot of explaining to do. And here's what I finally will come around to. Jefferson Morley was new, really, to the subject of President Kennedy's assassination, but thought that there were interesting things to be learned from the release of lots of documents as the result of the JFK Records Act. So he happened to be going through documents. He found a document where there was reference to Lee Oswald from October of 1960. From October of 1963 with a senior desk officer, a woman named Jane Roman. Jane Roman is this person. This is the story that I told you in the company of John Barber a couple of weeks ago. But it's very revealing because of how someone like Jeff Morley and someone like Dr. John Newman, how they deal with this, because I think it's a very revealing moment in our story of trying to move from darkness to light, trying to crawl our way from the deceit and the deception of the official versions of the story, and trying to learn more about the context and the continuity of figures of interest who played influential roles in how this story, how it ends up with us. A lot happens before it ends up with us. There are a lot of people with their fingerprints on it. So in 1994, Jeff Morley is a editor, weekend edition of the Washington Post. He finds a document with a lady's name on it. She's a senior desk officer within James Angleton's counterintelligence division at the CIA at the peak of the Cold War, October 1963. Her name's she's signed on this, and it talks about Lee Oswald. And it's routine correspondence. She's responding to a routine inquiry from Mexico City Station. She's signing a piece of paper which has misleading information. And the reason we know it's misleading is because now we've got the release of these documents. So Jeff Morley thinks this woman would be interesting to talk to, especially this many years later, and the popularity of the JFK film and all of that might be interesting to talk to her. He tracks her down. She lives a mile from his house. He says, could I come over and talk to you a little bit? She's a little reluctant, but eventually she agrees, and he has one of the greatest ideas that anybody ever had in the whole world. He calls John Newman, who was an Army intelligence executive and assistant to General Odom at the National Security Agency, a specialist in Southeast Asian studies, and the author of a very important book called JFK and Vietnam. He calls John Newman and he says, hey, you're very good at interpreting internal files, CIA routing stuff and things that I'm not that up on right at this moment. I've found this lady, she worked for Jim Angleton. Would you like to come with me? And man, that's one of the best ideas anybody ever had in the world.
No kidding.
Yeah, so he brings with him the world's leading authority on the infrastructure of the CIA. And so, which I think is just pretty cool. We got lucky that day. They go to her house. She's very nice. It's a very nice neighborhood. It's a very pleasant environment. Everything's nice and neat. She may have offered them cookies and tea for all I know. They spread out some papers, and Jeff Morley records the conversation, and John Newman says, among other things, he says, so I'm trying to understand really what your take is on this communication between the Mexico City Station and your desk. And she says, she volunteers, she says, well, I'm signing off on something I know is not true. Now, some people would just think, wow, I don't know what that means, but it sounds important, and they'd say, thank you very much, and they'd tip their hat and they'd go home. But because these guys are super smart, and they're very cautious, they're not nuts, they're not wackos, they're not extremists, you know, they're not what we associate with the worst within the JFK community of these conspiracy nuts who make obscene and absurd and extreme claims based upon insufficient understanding, insufficient evidence, and based upon their own lack of discipline. These guys are smart, so they just sit there, and John Newman says, well, I'm not saying there has to be a sinister interpretation. I'm just saying, you know, it's one thing if I say to you, you do not have a need to know. But it's something else, it seems kind of strategic, if I say to you, here's some information that I know is not true. And so I guess the thing I'm really asking you to address head on is, does this indicate to you an operational interest in Oswald? Now remember, this document, these documents he's referring to, this exchange, this is 6 weeks prior to the assassination of President Kennedy. These documents are centered around a figure named Lee Oswald in Mexico City at the Cuban consulate at the Soviet Embassy in Mexico City. This is how the CIA in Mexico City, that station, and CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, how they're dealing with this subject 6 weeks prior to the assassination. So he says to her, so what I'm asking you to address, what I'm asking really you to address head on is, does this indicate to you an operational interest in Oswald? And she says, yes. To me, it represents, she says it represents a keen interest held very closely on a need-to-know basis. That's the phrase. A keen interest held very closely on a need-to-know basis. She's referring to the executives above her. She's just she's an officer, a desk officer, but she's not somebody who's doing, she's not initiating policy or projects. She's doing basically what is authorized by the people above her and Western Hemisphere Division and Counterintelligence Special Investigations Group and possibly other compartments within counterintelligence. But this is, you know, this is the realm, this is the most compartmentally insulated, most protected, most controlled environment of the culture of the CIA at the peak of the Cold War. These are ultimate executives in the CIA who are part of the fabric of the national security state. They're telling her to do this stuff, which is, it obviously involves in some form or another a keen interest in Oswald held very closely on a need-to-know basis. She's talking about the executives above her in Special Investigations Counterintelligence Division.
And why this is important, folks, is because this is confirming that the CIA did indeed know about Oswald 7 weeks before, let me repeat that, 7 weeks before the assassination. And everybody claims that nobody knew about Oswald.
Or that their interest in him was routine is what they really claim. But what this is, the operative part of this is operational. He says to you, does this indicate to you an operational, meaning the name Oswald, the figure Oswald, the files Oswald, Lee Henry Oswald, Lee Harvey Oswald, is this part of an operation, do you think? And she's saying yes. And so here's the moment that would make the great scene in the movie, if some intelligent screenwriter would write it out. These two guys, she's nice, they're nice, everybody's nice. They thank her, they pack up, they walk out, she closes the door. They don't get as far as the street, and they stop and they look at each other, and they say, and this is like November 3rd, I think, 1994. They look at each other, and they stop, and one of them says to the other, what just happened in there? Because what happened was, we who are seeking to know what the hell are they hiding, why won't they come clean, why do you have to take them to court for 10 years to try to get them to comply with the law about releasing their JFK-related materials, we were in one place, collectively, before those two guys walked into that lady's house. When they walked out, we were in a different place. And you can't put the genie back in the bottle. That's a fact. We're in a different place as a result of that conversation that Jeff Morley and Dr. John Newman had with Jane Roman. And people, I think, I think it's to our advantage as citizens and as educated people who want to be able to make decisions based upon reliable information, I think it's important for us to know what happened on that occasion and to understand why it's important what Jane Roman said.
And this is what Alan Dale brings out in his interviews with all these people, folks. Deep, deep, heavy research, the real deal. And just let me give out his website once more. It is jfkessentials.com, and you can listen to his interviews with these great people at jfklancer.com. And JFK Lancer, of course, folks, is operated by Deb Conway. Those of you that are on the JFK groups or on Facebook will be familiar with that name. She puts on the conference every year in November. This year she is passing on that. She's had some terrifying health issues. And I fully back her for taking this year off because she needs to recuperate big time. In the meantime, I'm going to plug my book one more time, JFK Assassination, from the Oval Office to DEALEY PLAZA. What it features, folks, is Ted Sorensen's last interview, and he goes in depth on the assassination. It features all kinds of stuff like first-person witness interviews with James Tague, as most of you know, was wounded also in DEALEY PLAZA. Sherry Feaster we touched on. Mark Lane wrote the foreword, and he's featured in the book.
Don't forget about Abraham Bolden.
And Monsieur Bolden, yes, Abraham Bolden, a real American hero. And some news there, folks. I've got 2 documentaries that are going to be put up on Amazon. Within 2 weeks, you'll be able to order First-Person Witnesses and the documentary about Abraham Bolden's life. So that's coming up. Alan, you are a famous musician as well. You've got some great road stories. I'm going to lighten it up because, man, that was intense. But first of all, I want to tell you about how you ended up in Ted Kennedy's house, massaging the dog. This is folks.
No, to tell you the truth, I've had improbable good fortune in my life, and certainly I'm grateful and thankful. A lot of it seems very strange, especially in relation to earlier experiences from childhood. I met Robert Kennedy when I was 6 years old, and he was a figure of consequence in my family's life.
What about Martin Luther King?
Well,
look, have you ever seen the movie Forrest Gump, folks? You know how Forrest Gump meets all these incredible people and makes an influence?
Yeah.
There you go.
Well, if I'd taken a page from his book, then I should have started, Bubba Gump Shrimp or something, and then I'd be probably better off in many respects. But I'm a professional jazz drummer, show drummer, band leader. I've played things, a broad range of different types of things, lots of private parties, things at the Kennedy Center, Lincoln Center in New York, and a lot of, a little bit of public stuff every now and then, jazz festivals and things like that, but most of my bread and butter work is private. My dad was a musician. I grew up on the road. The first time my father worked Las Vegas was for 5 months in 1947 is when my dad went to Vegas originally. Wow. That's pretty strong because obviously in those days it was a different kind of scene. It wasn't, Disney World with a bigger budget like it is now. It was a very, very different kind of scene, and it was pretty cool from what I understand. So I became close to, my dad was friends with a lot of great musicians, one of which was a wonderful, sort of legendary jazz arranger and piano player and jazz organist named Milt Buckner. And Milt Buckner was one of my ultimate favorite people in life. He was Lionel Hampton's piano player and arranger. He wrote Hamp's Boogie Woogie. He did the original arrangement of Flyin' Home, which was probably Hamp's most famous big hit after Lionel Hampton left Benny Goodman's band. He was a pioneer in the jazz organ, and he was a very influential pianist and very influential arranger. He's the person that George Shearing, Dave Brubeck, and the great, your fellow Canadian ultimate master Oscar Peterson credited with introducing to them the idea of what's called locked hands chords, because Milty was 5 feet tall and 5 feet wide like Jimmy Rushing. He's a very short, stout man, and he had little short, stout fingers, and he was cute,
God knows I can relate to stout with tiny fingers, yes.
Anyway,
All right, Buddy Rich. You got to tell a Buddy Rich story.
Well, the thing about Dr. King, I was just going to say, is that my godfather was Milt Buckner. He was a black man. I traveled extensively when I was a child. I was in lots of different schools. I went to school in Atlanta, Georgia, when desegregation came to the public schools of Atlanta. I was there. I remember arguing with some other third or fourth grader who's told me that it was impossible for me to have an uncle who was colored, was the term at the time, because his father was a doctor. And I said, oh. So that's the kind of environment these people, you know, and I was there where one day everybody was there. The next day, absolutely 60% of the children who were enrolled at the school were gone, and I never saw them again. It was E. Rivers Elementary School off Peachtree Street in Atlanta, Georgia, because that day, where all of those kids were pulled out in one gigantic gesture, their parents pulled them out, stuck them into private schools, so they wouldn't have to go to school with this impossibly quiet, shy, adorable little black girl that came on a bus to E. Rivers Elementary School. And I remember that because I was only there a short time, I remember that she was the only person who said goodbye to me when it was time for me to leave. So I was...
Because I think it's essential for the folks today to know how we got a black man in the White House.
It's quite a story, isn't it? In any event, my Uncle Milty came to visit us in Louisville, Kentucky. He came, I would have done anything with him. I absolutely adored him. He was my favorite uncle. And he was just a close family friend, but I knew him from birth, and I felt very privileged to know him. He was one of my favorite people. He was a wonderful, genuinely good-hearted person, saw the best in people, and was one of the world's most respected piano players and organists. He was revered in France. He was very big in the European jazz festival circuit. And he wanted to take me to a church on a Sunday in 1966. And my parents said, sure. So they gave me to him, and we went to a church, and I was introduced to someone who wasn't a lot taller than I was, I thought. And the details of it have been lost in memory, sadly, because while I knew who Robert Kennedy was as a 6-year-old, I truly did not know who Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was, and so when I was introduced to him, I'm ashamed to admit, it didn't register. I probably said, how do you do, or something like that, because I was polite, and it was important for my Uncle Milty to take me to this event, and I was there. But it is kind of, it is slightly surreal to me, because I didn't realize until the last couple of years when my mother casually alluded to this, and I stopped in my tracks because it rang a very dim bell with me. I had some strange, improbable, and extraordinary opportunities as a child to meet great people and see things that were unusual or interesting, probably. And this was one of the most extraordinary opportunities of my life. But because I was so young, and because I honestly had not encountered Dr. King in the 6 years that I'd been on Earth, I didn't really know who he was. And when I spoke to my father to try to corroborate that what my mom was saying was true, the first thing he said was it was a Sunday. And so I know it's true, but it is a strange thing. The thing about Senator Kennedy's house, I had been called to... This is all strange. I had a trio at Ethel Kennedy's home at Hickory Hill. And Hickory Hill is the home that JFK and Jackie bought the home. And it was really too large for them at the time. They didn't need it, and so they sold it to Bobby and Ethel, I think, for $125,000 or something like that. I'm not sure. In any event, it is the primary Kennedy residence around Washington, D.C., and it is to this day. And Mrs. Kennedy still lives there. When I was there, the first time, I think, I was there with a little trio playing background music for a private reception that Mrs. Kennedy was hosting. And during the course of this unbelievably strange and improbable scene of me being there, and the circumstances of my being there, completely unrelated to any experience that I had as a child, which seemed like, well, I've got two paths here that are truly strange, and they're connected. But I don't know how. It's just, I don't have any explanation. It's just, I have to shrug and say, well, it's interesting. And I had one of Mrs. Kennedy's sheepdogs, a big sheepdog named Mulligan, who decided that Mulligan loved me. So I'm a drummer. I was playing brushes with a small drum set, and I got the brush in the right hand. With my left hand, I'm rubbing the stomach of this upside-down sheepdog that decided that it loves me. Mainly, I might not be putting this together all that impressively. I suspect that Mulligan loved me because I was willing to rub her stomach. You know what I mean? I believe it was probably, as superficial as that. But the truth is, I was in Mrs. Kennedy's house, and then she saw what was going on, and she yelled at Mulligan. She said, "Get her out of here. She doesn't have to be." And I said, "It's okay. I don't mind," and it's just strange, it's funny, and it was a wonderful scene, and she was incredibly nice, incredibly generous, and it was a thrill for me to be on those premises, where I saw lots of extraordinary artifacts on the wall and on the tables and on the piano and all things like that, including a large poster, framed poster of the inaugural address, which Ted Sorensen had probably a majority hand in composing. And it's framed on a hall inside, on the way to the living room at Hickory Hill, and it's inscribed in JFK's handwriting to Bobby and Ethel, with whatever message follows. So that was interesting. Senator Kennedy was at that event. He heard the little trio that I had. Somebody gave his office my phone number, and the following week on a Monday, I answered the phone, and it was somebody from Senator Kennedy's office. They said, "Would you be available to play a little party at Senator Kennedy's house?" And I said, "When?" And they said, "Tomorrow." And I said, "Tomorrow?" And they said, "Yeah." And I said, "Yes." And so we did, and there were interesting parts of that as well. So it was just nice, it was nice. And then eventually I got an unsolicited letter from Senator Kennedy thanking us for the wonderful music we provided at his reception. And that letter helped me get high-profile work in the D.C. society scene, which eventually included providing music for visiting heads of state and at lots of embassies. I played for Pierre Salinger and Letitia Baldridge, who was Jacqueline Kennedy's social secretary at the ambassador from France's residence, where I played 3 or 4 times, and I had an exchange with Pierre Salinger, which went something like this. He danced with the Mrs. Andriani, the ambassador's wife, and he looked over at me and big smile, and I was enthralled and amazed that Pierre Salinger was right in front of me. So I did something that I normally would not do in a circumstance such as that, but it was Pierre Salinger, and I thought, I'm going to do it. So I walked over to him, and I had a pen and a little piece of paper, and I said, "Could I ask you to sign this? It would be wonderful for me if I could get you to sign this." And he smiled. He said, he was happy to sign it. And while he's signing my autograph, I said, "Did you ever think it was strange that President Kennedy had fired, like Allen Dulles, would be then involved in investigating President Kennedy's assassination?" I said something very much like that, very close to that, probably not that many words. And he never stopped smiling. He had his ubiquitous cigar in his mouth, and he says to me, "Dull, duller, Dulles." And that's what he said. Why he said that, I don't know. That's the line that Churchill used to describe John Foster Dulles. But that's what had registered with him on the subject of Allen Dulles, and that's what came out when I said what I said to him. And it was just it was not an important moment, but that's what happened. That's what he said. So I thought I'd tell you about it.
Pierre Salinger, by the way, folks, was JFK's press secretary. Do you want to talk about Bobby at all, where you were? If you don't, we can move on.
I had no choice about where I was. My parents were engaged in trying to help Robert Kennedy win the Democratic nomination of his party in California. Party was the campaign party headquarters for that night was at the Ambassador Hotel in the Embassy Ballroom. I'd been in the ballroom earlier in the day. My mom and dad alternated. We had a car. We had one car. We weren't a two-car family. And so they alternated on different shifts. And what they did was and this was not uncommon. This wasn't the only occasion where they did this. They did this on election days wherever we were. They drove elderly voters by the carload, picked them up at their homes, and took a group of them at a time to the polls where these elderly but dedicated Kennedy supporters, they weren't driving people who were going to vote for Eugene McCarthy. They were driving people who had Kennedy buttons on them, right? And so my mom did the early shift. My dad was a musician, so he usually wasn't up until noon. And so during the day, he took me into the Embassy Ballroom where I was hopeful I would see Senator Kennedy, whom I had met prior to that, but he was not there. I remember very, very bright and hot television lights. If you saw what TV lights were like back in those days, you wouldn't believe it because they were so bright and so hot. It's amazing anybody could function in front of a TV camera because the lights were so bright and hot, and that's what registered with me. And there really wasn't a lot going on. All I know is I'm aware, because I do vaguely remember the next morning where apparently I had fallen asleep or had been allowed to be dumped on a bed upstairs at the Ambassador. And that was not uncommon because I'd hang in there as long as I could if we were out, and then I'd fall asleep and they'd plop me down on a bed someplace and then take me to wherever we were staying. We were not staying at the Ambassador, of that I'm certain. But I woke up wherever we were staying, at some other hotel or something, or a small apartment complex in L.A. And I woke up early the next morning, and my dad was awake, and that was the thing that registered with me that was shocking to me. Because he was I never saw my father until 11 o'clock in the morning, or most often around noon, which is when he would get up, because he was a product of the era where professional musicians worked 6 or 7 nights a week, and the gigs were over at 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. So he was up all night, and he'd sleep until noon every day. This was an exception, and it was extraordinary, and I had no idea why. But when I woke up, I saw him. I don't remember seeing my mom, but I do remember seeing him with his hands clasped in front of him, leaning forward, sitting down, looking at the television. And I probably said something like, "What's going on?" And what I remember him saying was, "They should take the guy who did this and machine gun him against the wall." And that's how I learned that that's how I learned that the worst thing in the world happened. Right.
Let's talk about something happy now. Let's talk about some of the work you did with Buddy Rich. Can you imagine, folks? Not only has Alan interviewed all these people, just told you all the stories about meeting the Kennedys and everything, but he also worked very closely with Buddy Rich and also Louis Bellson. Go ahead.
I wouldn't say that I ever worked with Buddy. I worked for him as a frequent informal member of his entourage. I started playing drums when I was 5 years old. Louis Bellson was my teacher. He was married to Pearl Bailey. She was my Aunt Pearl, and I had a lot of wonderful experience with her. She was hilarious and wonderful, and exactly the way she appeared to be on television, that was the way she was in real life. She was very funny, and she made the best fried chicken I've ever tasted. So I was very close to Louis, and I traveled with Louis all over the country, and eventually as an adult I actually did work with him and was paid to do concerts with him, and some of that I've put on YouTube, of me playing drum battles with my teacher and stuff like that, which was strange. Eventually, after 38 years of marriage, my Aunt Pearl passed away. I was with Louis in Philadelphia the night of her funeral. He and I had dinner alone together. Both of his kids were somewhere, but they were not with us. And And then 2 years later, about 2 years, maybe a little bit more than that, Louis met a woman named Francine Wright on the last day of a 9-day jazz cruise ship. And he married her. And it's a funny story, but I'm not going to bother you with that, but it's a truly strange story about the circumstances of his meeting this woman. And the short version is my band played Louis' wedding reception. And I think that's pretty cool.
That is very cool.
Yeah, because I introduced him. I said to him, do you want to sit in? I had an instrumental quartet. It was vibes, guitar, bass, and drums. And it was a beautiful swinging situation. We're playing elegant swinging stuff, nice Latin tunes, and all the standard Duke Ellington, Cole Porter, Johnny Mercer stuff, all the Jobim bossa novas, and beautiful ballads, and a lot of the stuff Ella Fitzgerald and Nat King Cole recorded, and Sinatra. That's the stuff we love, right? So I said to him, do you want to sit in? And he said, yeah, I'll play 2 tunes. And I said, okay, I'll introduce you. So I introduced him to this wedding party, to his wife's family mainly. And she's wearing the bridal gown, you know, and he says, I said, he may have taught me everything I know, but he hasn't taught me everything he knows. And I introduced the great Louis Bellson.
Oh, my God.
So he sat in and he played my drums, and it was kind of funny, and it was wonderful, you know. And because of my relationship with Louis, and because I revered Buddy Rich, certainly as a musician,
Go ahead.
I got to be on the inside with him. I really did. I was too young to be a friend of his, but I was on the inside with him for the last 10 years of his life. My name was on a list of people whose calls were accepted during the time where he'd had a quadruple bypass operation up in Michigan. I spoke at his, I was on the phone, and at his bedside was his sister Jo, and she gave me a complete report on his status during that scary time when he'd had a quadruple bypass, which bought him 3 years of his life, which coincided with the birth, the period of first years of his little grandson's life, which was so meaningful to him because he'd had a daughter, but he had not had a son, and now with his little grandson, he had a son, and it was sweet and wonderful, and he mellowed. I saw quite a change in him during that last 3 years, where he was less volatile and less explosive and less all of the things that were truly terrifying, and which you could not capture simply by talking about it. You'd have to see it to believe it. He had a rage, the likes of which I hope I will never see in another human being, and I felt like it was difficult for him to control it, but he did, you know, pretty good job reining it in because once it started to go, it was extremely powerful. I'm not sure where it came from. His friend Stanley Kay, who had known him since childhood, told me it was all about his father and the circumstances of his being the breadwinner for the family from the time he was at least 5, maybe 6. It's not apocryphal, it's not mythology, it's a fact that Buddy was playing, and the family was being compensated by the time he was 2. By the time he was 2 years old in vaudeville, he's earning his parents an extra $5 a week on the vaudeville circuit. By the time he's 6, he's touring Australia as a solo act. The parents' act has gone by the wayside because the kid, you know, the little boy had succeeded his parents in terms of popularity. And he was a fascinating guy. He was a very complicated person. I think he was insecure about some things, probably. I think he didn't have much in the way of a formal education, but he was very smart in terms of his street education. You know, he and Frank Sinatra shared that kind of thing in common. It's no wonder they were such rivals when they both worked for Tommy Dorsey. Competed with each other for Dorsey's approval and affection, and Dorsey just, you know, he just loved that. He played that. But I loved the guy. I mean, I did love him. I could tell you stories about him for a long time. The thing is that he could be extremely warm. He could be very nice. And at the same time, there seemed always to be this underlying sense that when you least expected it, some kind of something could set him off, and you know, if you were ever the focus of his rage, that would be probably a bad experience. So what you wanted to do, if you had any sense at all, is try to avoid that kind of scenario. And I was successful at avoiding that scenario. I never had a bad scene with him, and I knew him for 10 years.
Do you want to talk about Sam Butera and the car he got?
Well,
Or any other story?
my friend Sam Butera was a legendary tenor saxophone player and maybe the swingingest person who ever lived on earth. Sam Butera was Louis Prima's band leader. Like Louis Prima, he's from New Orleans, Louisiana, where he was completely immersed in the music of the black musicians of that extraordinary city. Enormous ethnic diversity in the city, a period of strict segregation, theoretically, where white musicians were prohibited by law from playing with black musicians, but that didn't stop Sam Butera, who was dark-complected and had, as Sammy Davis Jr. used to say to him, questionable hair. So when an Irish cop named Junior O'Rourke busted a gig and took some of the white musicians who were playing with the black band off to jail, he skipped over Sam because he wasn't positive that Sam was a white guy. So that tells a lot about where Sam was coming from and what his early influences were. So he ends up going to work for Louis Prima for 23 and a half years in Las Vegas, and he redefines what Louis Prima's act was. He redefines what they were doing so that the Las Vegas lounge scene became a thing unto itself. And during the period in American popular culture between Elvis Presley and the Beatles, they were the most popular act in show business, as evidenced by the fact that Ed Sullivan would turn the show over to them for 18 minutes at a time when they were on the East Coast, because Louis Prima didn't like to fly, but they'd drive to New York and do a couple of weeks, and Ed Sullivan made the most of it, so he'd give them, spots on consecutive weeks. Sam got to know the Spilatro brothers, the characters, the real live guy that Joe Pesci played in Casino. He was a close acquaintance, I think is a reasonable way to put it, of some guy named Sam Giancana, who was so fond of Sam Butera and Louis Prima and Keely Smith and the Witnesses that in 1959, Sam Giancana gave Sam Butera a Jaguar convertible.
Oh my God.
So,
Incredible stuff.
so I've been in Ethel Kennedy's home, and I was very, very close. Like he was like family to me, of someone to whom Sam Giancana gave an automobile. So that's an odd. You talk about degrees of separation. It's just an improbable bridge, in a way. It's kind of funny. Sam was a cartoon caveman. He was not the most educated person in the world, but he was one of the most influential tenor saxophonists, and he's all over the soundtrack of The Jungle Book, and he's one of the greatest musicians and one of the greatest entertainers of all time. And I really loved him. He was a beautiful person in some ways. And I loved him, and he recorded with me. He did a tune with me on an album called 5 Months, 2 Weeks, 2 Days, where he swung his guts out.
Alan Dale's our guest tonight, folks. I love these behind-the-scenes stories. It's something I love about doing Night Fright. You get some great guests on like Alan, and he had referenced John Barber before. Bill Burns was on the show telling all these behind-the-scenes showbiz stories, and I just love them. I can't get enough of them. Alan's also done some incredible work, if you've been listening for the last little while, on interviewing some of the heavyweights, the real-to-goodness heavyweights in the JFK assassination. JFKessentials.com is one of the websites you can find information. It's a forum. You can join the forum. The other one is JFKlancer.com, and you can find the actual recordings, the audio recordings of the interviews with Peter Dale Scott, Jeff Morley, Bill Simpage, Josiah Thompson, Gerald McKnight, Larry Hancock, David Talbot, and Sherry Feaster, and he's got more to come. Who's your next interview, Alan?
There are a couple that I'm really excited about. I've been acquainted with John Newman, Dr. John Newman, really for quite some time. And I've had private conversations with him, which I'll never forget, which were extremely meaningful to me. He's the author of JFK and Vietnam and Oswald and the CIA. He's also written an extraordinary book about the sacred teachings of Jesus in light of yogic mysticism. It's a theological, philosophical dissertation on the Gospel of Thomas. So he is now no longer affiliated with his career as an Army intelligence executive or all of that, He's a yoga instructor, and he's one of the most interesting and most knowledgeable people I've ever encountered in life. Also has the discipline of a monk in terms of his caution and his care about trying to get things right in his research. So I am going to speak with him sometime during the next couple of weeks. We've made an arrangement to do an interview, which I'm looking forward to, the focus of which will be the fact that he, after being away from the JFK story and doing other things for a number of years, he got back in a huge way, and he is currently working on what will be minimally a 4-volume set on the assassination. And that's extraordinary news. That's exciting news among JFK scholars. So I'll speak with John Newman. There's an extraordinary man in Great Britain named Malcolm Blunt, who is an unsung hero in the world of JFK researchers. He's somebody who is supremely influential to many of the people that I admire the most. He works behind the scenes, and his area of expertise is the National Archives. He's also supremely knowledgeable about the infrastructure of the CIA and all of the complexities among different divisions of CIA, which we think are relevant in terms of addressing the subject of President Kennedy's assassination. He's a walking encyclopedia about all kinds of aspects to this story, which is informative and inspiring to people who write books, which they then dedicate to Malcolm Blunt. He contacted me, and he's going to be in Washington, D.C. Next week, and I'm very hopeful that I actually called Jeff Morley and said, you know, Malcolm is coming to town. Do you want to go with me and see him? And Jeff said yes, so I'm very hopeful I'll be able to record something with both of them. And I've talked to Jim D'Eugenio, and he's agreed to do a program with me on a theme, and the theme has to do with President Kennedy's foreign policy, and being looking at that in a very fresh, with a fresh perspective, informed by the influence of two, well, I would put it this way, a man named Edmund Gullion, who coincidentally, totally improbable, but simply a coincidence, who married one of Bill Simpich's aunts. So literally a relative of Bill Simpich was a State Department official named Ed Gullion, who in the 40s and 50s was influential to a young senator from Massachusetts named John F. Kennedy.
That really does come full circle, doesn't it?
Say that again, please.
It really does come full circle, doesn't it?
Yeah, sometimes. You know, it's interesting. It's interesting. Anyway, Jim, who's obviously one of the most knowledgeable, broadly knowledgeable people, whose work focuses on different aspects of President Kennedy's life and death, is focusing with a particular presentation on the influence of Ed Gullion and the extent to which JFK may be misrepresented in the popular literature as a cold warrior who then turned. And so I'll tell you more about it once we actually do the program, but I contacted Jim with the explicit idea of maybe doing a program focusing exclusively on that aspect of Jim's research, which I attended he participated in a conference in November. I thought his presentation was compelling, and I'm interested in spreading the word about that. And that goes back to your question about, you know, why I'm into it and that kind of thing. I think that these are important issues which are informative, not just in an irrelevant way about something that is a subculture. People have various degrees of obsession about, you know, President Kennedy's this or that. I think that these issues are informative if we want to have a sense of who we are. Who are we at this point in our nation's history? Because if it turns out that the aberration in the form of a catastrophic world-shaping event, JFK's assassination, if the aberration was not the event, but that the aberration was the particular guy who happened to find his way into that office, a man who was sincerely and genuinely ahead of his time as a proponent of peace, as someone who wanted to replace the redundancy and the competition of the Cold War and the race to the moon with cooperation. He wanted to get rid of the weapons of mass destruction in favor of essentially a partnership with the Soviet Union to explore the solar system. He actually was thinking beyond landing men on the moon and was thinking in terms of joint American-Soviet exploration of Mars and things like that.
We're going to have to wrap up because the music's about to start. And there it is. Alan Dale, folks.